So dorky.
The other thing, I'm in my cabinets are being installed, and I'm by the highway, so there shouldn't be too much background noise, but there might be sounds of like screwdrivers drilling things and trucks going by, but you should be able to hear it okay.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, Asia, we should be there.
Great. Welcome to Inspiration and Adaptation, monthly artist talk. Today we are visiting the studio of Joel Isaak. I'm excited to speak with Joel today because as a person who was raised on Indigenous land, I'm still continually learning, and I expect to be for my whole life. After all, Indigenous people have been in this area for thousands and thousands of years. And my life is a short one, really, in which to try to gain so much contextual information about the Dena'ina and Sugpiaq people who call this place home, the ancient Ketchimaq people before them, and the living artists today who are bringing this story forward, expanding, sharing, and teaching so much. I'm excited to be speaking with Joel Isaak. Joel's a sculptor and a longtime advisor to Bunnell. His family is from the village of Chigalnik, Point Possession, and he currently lives in Soldotna. His Dena'ina name, would you say that for us, Joel? Your Dena'ina name?
Łiq'a, yes.
And what does it translate into?
It's Łiq'a means salmon and yes means skin. So it's salmon skin.
As an artist and educator, a lifelong learner, Joel combines Western educational model with traditional Alaska Native ways of life. His language work inspires him, his artistic practice, and his educational methodology. He uses multicultural communication as a medium to aid in language revitalization. And art, he says, is a safeguard for him and a medium for generating understanding and communicating hard truths to facilitate wellness for a wide range of audiences. Wow, congratulations. And welcome, Joel. That's an exciting mission. And I'm excited to hear about how your more recent work and the work you're doing, which you're sharing with us in the studio today, kind of elucidates that goal of facilitating wellness for a wide range of audiences. So where are we today?
Janan, Katnu Shagu Shakaya Kelanda. We're over here in Kenai. Janan, thank you for having me and joining me today. And I'm in my studio. It's next to the highway, so if you hear traffic going by, it's because I'm by the traffic. And I'm down here in between. My studio is near Kenai, and I'm here with my the figures that I've been working on for my recent project for the Yukon Koyukon Health Corporation Hospital in Bethel, YKHC. And yeah, that's where I'm at.
Wow. Well, could you kind of like give us a little bit of an orientation to your studio and the kinds of things that you make there? I'm seeing.
Yeah. So this is my work table here, which is very clean. I cleaned it up to have company over, and then it's a like 2-car garage, and I have my figures here, and that's the kind of space. I have my woodworking, which is all covered up right now, but I have woodworking stuff, and that's what I'm working on right now. So what I often will do is I'll open up my garage doors too, and I've wheeled the figures. All of my figures are on casters, and so I'll put plywood on the ground and then wheel them outside so that I have more space to see things separated out or things like that.
That's wonderful. And it appears these sculptures are they in clay or wax? What am I looking at?
So the versions behind me, they're in clay. So kind of go through the process.
Yeah.
So I'll start off. I'm going to screen share a few images of kind of how I went through and make these figures. The ones that I just showed you are in clay. They have steel skeletons, but that's like step 5.
Mm-hmm.
So if I share the PowerPoint and slideshow. All right, are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So initially what I started out with is sketches. And so this is a sketch of, I wanted a mother, daughter, or an older woman and younger woman duo putting up fish. And this is a sketch that I was working on to see different ways that people put up fish. And so it's like, here's out a fish cutting table. This was one version. And then a little ways down the river, there's a father-son who are fishing with a net. And that's what this sketch is for. And then I went from that into starting to explore different clothing pattern options. And I looked at historical photos from museum collections and exploring that. The bronze doesn't have color, but sometimes the color is helpful for either showing texture or pattern and just what's possible. So I'm looking at the net feature. And then we went from, the committee went from what I kind of showed, like here's an option of like cutting tables. I showed a fish rack. So this is kind of a lintel post model that's common in the Łiq'a Delta area. And with there's lots of different kinds of ways of cutting fish. And so I sketched a few, and then we talked about it for probably 20 minutes about here's different ways of if you turn the fish this way when they're first drying, or once they've been flipped with the tails up, they're this way. But if you're further down the river and it's August, they're this way. So it's just trying to figure out part of that story of like which process of putting up fish and what time of year is this happening and where is it at and what kind of fish. So we had good conversations about that to make sure it felt accurate to the place where people are from in that area. And then looking at how the figures or the scenes connect to each other. Bethel is on a bend in a river. And so the hospital has a circle design motif. And the entrance is part of the circle, and it goes through the curvature of the architecture of the front of the building. And the idea is that the fish camp kind of continues that circle outside, and the first level is a water themed level. So that's why there's that curve of the river, and the two duos are following along that curve. So just different sketches, doing a little bit of watercolor, exploring the different options. I'm much more of a 3D artist, so I do less detail work in faces and structures in the 2D, and then I work more of that out in the 3D. So that's, I'm gonna exit the screen share. That's the step 1 of sending images to the committee to say, here's what the options are. And then I'm gonna bring you over to my work table. And then I flew out to Bethel, and I brought these figures with me. So I'm gonna slide the mother-daughter over real fast. So this is the father-son fishing duo. So what I'm able to do with this is, these are to scale. They're about a 1/4 scale. And I marked where the joints are. You can see kind of the red Sharpie, and then did the calculations to figure out how big the bones would be. And you can see the son has a little paper fish in his net that's there. And that way people could stand up and walk around them. I can bend these if I need to where it's like, oh, we want this arm in a little bit more, him tilted more. So that it really allows the committee to be kind of in the driver's seat of what is happening. And then I'm able to pick up the whole thing and show like, okay, so if these guys are here, and then you have the mother who's putting up a fish, which I don't have the fish rack set up right now, but she'd be standing here, handing the mother her fish to put up on the fish rack. And the fish would be hanging here. So these have flown checked luggage back and forth, so they're a little bit more frazzled than they were fresh. But once I do that, then I have all my calculations on the figures. And let me come around to the front of the table. I do the math, and then I cut it out in bigger steel. So this, I multiply that by a ratio, and that becomes the spine section that I cut out in larger pieces of steel. So that's how I use the maquettes with the committee. And then you can kind of see, if I wheel her over, if there's layers in her hand, where her hand used to be. There's a steel skeleton in here, just like our bones, and then there's plaster, and then I put clay over that. And the clay is what I'm able to sculpt in. So once the clay is on, I can use varying tools, and I'll show on her hair. The clay is an oil-based clay, so if I can use tools to carve into it, and it just shows how pliable the clay is. When I'm first putting on the clay, I like to have it a little warm so it's easier to move. It's kind of like giving someone a massage. If they're really stiff, it's harder. And then when I'm working on them with like a loop tool, where it's more of a carving tool, it's easier if I'm carving into the clay, if it's colder and it takes off more like a peel of it versus being mushy. So once I do that, this clay is done. I'm gonna show you on one of the other statues that I've done is Grandma Olga Isaak in Ship Creek. And so this is Olga. This is an example. I do a silicone mold over the face, and then I do a plaster mother mold, which is hard. And so I'm just gonna show you what that looks like. So once the plaster is cured, you take the front off and the back off, and then slice. You can put a seam, and so I slice up the back of the head, and then you can peel. This is a flexible silicone. I can peel that off, and now I have to put this back together again and then pour wax into it. So if I bring it back over to the table, I did a wax version, and I can show you what that looks like. So when I finish something in clay, before the silicone goes on, I show the committee it again, and they give me feedback for what they might want to see, like, oh, the eyelids are the wrong shape, or can you make him look a little older, or, oh, it's great, go ahead. Different feedback that I got. So I tie it together, and you can see in here, there's wax that's been built up inside the pink silicone. And I pop off the two mother mold pieces. This is already cooled because I poured it in yesterday, but I'll take a ladle of hot wax, pour it in, and then slosh it around, pour it out so that this is hollow. And then the same thing, there's a seam up the back. And this is the little boy's wax. And then pry it off.
So that wax is thick enough, you don't have to worry about cracking it in this process of extracting.
If you do it thick enough, you don't. Mm-hmm. And you're going for 3/16 to 1/4 of an inch thick, which his neck is a little thinner than that right now for the one that I'm showing you guys.
All of these steps are leading toward a bronze statue, is that right?
So this is the wax, and anything that's in wax will show up in metal. Okay. And so now I'm in this stage. So I finished sculpting the clay. I molded it and now it's in wax. And you can see like there's a bubble on his nose. And there's kind of a hole right there on his cheek because I did this one really fast when I poured the wax. And there's kind of a bubble on his eye there. So I can take my tools and in wax, I can carve out the wax. So you sculpt it in wax as well to get rid of all those little imperfections. And then, so you can, the wax is harder to sculpt in than the clay. Once this turns into metal, it also gets sculpted again. It's just a lot more labor intensive to sculpt metal because you can't just take your fingers and be like, oh, let's just crease that there with my thumbnail in bronze. So this gets put together, and then at the foundry, they cut it into pieces, and then the wax gets melted out, and then bronze gets poured into place, like the wax got poured into the silicone, bronze gets poured into where the wax used to be. So I can switch back to the screen share and show you the bronze pieces. This is the mother statue all put together. And you can see the weld lines. Here around her neck and her arms. She's wearing a cuspuk that's very similar to the daughter's cuspuk that I showed earlier. And this is a close-up of her face. So that's her in metal. And then this is a close-up of the gut parka that has the seams on the inside. We chose to show the seams on the outside for the ones that I did for the guys. So this is me with, well, I'm standing in place of where the son would be because he wasn't finished yet, holding the fish in the net next to the father figure.
Why did you choose to show the seams on the outside for the guys?
I've seen it both ways, and it's one of the talking with skin sewers and thinking about how I sew skins. It's a decorative stitch. So this is the kind of stitch that it is. I have my boots with me. So you're doing a lot of work to get that seam, and it looks folded like that. So it's a pretty visible piece. Visually, it's pretty visible. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of thread that's used in it. And so it's one of those things you can either showcase it or you can try and hide it. And so we chose to showcase it. Mm-hmm. And it gives, especially from a distance, this is one of the other things to consider when making statues for public interaction is what's the viewing distance? So having a really like thin, narrow seam, 20 feet away, you can't see that at all. So having the seams on the outside makes them about 1/8 of an inch thick, like wide. And so you can see them from further away. So it helps convey that quality to it. And this is just showing some of the spots. The shiny spots are parts that you take a diamond bit and clean up around his chin. And you can see on his shoulder where that's been welded together. And then it has to be retextured in bronze. So there's a third level of sculpting or a fourth level of sculpting that happens in bronze. This is showing a full wax figure put together. So when I showed the daughter, this is her in clay, and then I molded around her cuspuk that now you see it in wax. That's her all put together, and I built a scaffold to suspend her from. These are images that I send off to the committee and get feedback from them. And then this was the inspiration for the cuspuk that they gave me that image of her. So we did this hybridization of contemporary like cloth cuspuks, but with sealskin boots. And then the guys are wearing more historical gut parka with sealskin boots as well. So it's about conveying people as live people this is like I showed the little boys head. This is the daughter headshots together, and then that's her. She's not together. She's being welded together right now this week. So this is her in bronze. So you can see how the bronze pieces are in separate chunks, but they get welded together. And those are her hands.
Could you
go ahead?
Explain again just the step from wax to metal again? Was that silicone? Was that the step?
It's I don't do that step here, but I'll show you how it's done. Okay. So what happens, I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. You have the wax, and because this is a shape that only has one opening, like you can see how my hand fits in there. So there would be a chunk off the back of the head that's cut out like a plug. And then this whole thing has sprues, they're called sprues and gates, and they act like arteries. So if I have, there's like clay veins that get put in and all connect with each other. And wherever the wax is, the bronze flows. And so this whole thing is dipped in a silica shell, a molding material. It's like a slurry of silica sand, and you keep dipping it up, dipping, let it dry, dip, let it dry. Once that's thick enough, then the wax with its shell, you're just building a shell on the inside and outside so that it stays hollow, that gets turned, and then you put a flame and you melt out all the wax. And wherever the wax gets lost, it gets disappeared. It flows out and pools up. Now you have a shell that is on the inside and outside that, like the silicone, captures the texture and form. It's rigid, the form of the wax, but there's a void where the bronze flows. And so now the bronze gets to flow in between those two layers of shell, and there's bronze once it cools, and you have to chisel off that shell. So it goes from being a very flexible silicone, this pink silicone is very flexible, to a very rigid, hard, high temperature molding material.
And so the bronze are ultimately hollow statues.
Correct. So if, so for example, the fish that I did, they're that thick. So I can pour that solid. So the fish, this is like dry fish strip. That's solid. So it's pretty thick. When you get metal too thick, it starts to shrink and contract and warp when it cools. So if I were to do this one, you can see how thin that is compared to how thick that is. But this would be hollow on the inside. And then there's a stainless steel skeleton that goes inside the statue as well that acts as the support.
It's great to learn about how bronze statues are constructed. Is the process you use one that is commonly used?
Yeah, it's a lost wax method. It's what it's in Western art history. It's like the Greek lost method of bronze casting. Other cultures around the world have been using casting as well. The Greeks are known for their figurative life-size replicas of humans that are very realistic. But it's a common way to make something in wax and then melt it out and then put bronze where that was, or metal of any kind.
And so I'd love to ask you some questions about the kind of like the process and decision. So here you are telling a story about traditional life ways around the region of Bethel and family, at fish camp. And you are doing it in bronze, which wouldn't be an indigenous method, but how do you come to that decision to use, like a classical method to convey a more traditional story?
So part of the choice for the material is the longevity of working in bronze, and just a great material to capture. It casts really well, so it captures detail, and then the color of it gives you a lot of variation that stands the test of time, but also gets richer with time. So that's the kind of decision of like why this material, and then really the other piece about it is it allows the ability to convey living people versus that's one of the things thinking about this kind of monument. It's not really about freezing a snapshot moment of time that had existed in the past. It's more about the continuation of thousands of years of people in a place doing this shared life way. There is a present moment that's being captured, but also that future generations see themselves in it as well. So that's the goal of the conceptual part of this process has been to make people feel like they can identify with what the statues are doing. The statues look like they're like make sense on the land. So they're being installed where their feet are on ground versus on like a pedestal way out high up, dominating over the landscape. You can walk up to them. And they're in action of doing the things that we do, that people out there do. Alaskans put up fish. It's what we do.
Yeah, you grew up doing that, and you've talked a bit, previously. I'd love for you to share a bit more about the travel and the exposure that you've had to seeing, fish camp in action around Alaska, and how you kind of channeled those stories into the sculpture.
Yeah, so I had spent a few years going back out to the Łiq'a Delta area, and it was one of the trips I have good friends in Good News Bay and other villages around the area, but that's one of the places where we were staying there, and Roy and Minnie brought over fish, and they were like, Murray, it was in May. It was around. It's like 2 weeks from now when we were out there, and they brought over murre eggs and agudek and fish, and it was just like really, really good, like food that made me feel good. And I was able to like help. We went up the river and went fishing. Was able to help cut herring and get it up drying, and helping Minnie in her fish drying area. And it's just been part of those, like being able to go back to the same place and spending time in that region with the kids there. And that was one of the things that sculpting, I wanted it to feel like what I experienced in that area. I wanted the people from that place to feel like it was them and their land and their area. And that's part of the process of going through it.
What is, your choice of subject matter to fish camp? What is, could you talk a bit about what fish camp teaches that's so important to cultural sustainability and vibrancy?
I think part of it, there's something very specific about everyone's fish camp. It's like, that's where I go for fish. And it is often something you want to share with people. Like, hey, I want you to come visit us at fish camp. And so I was really honored to be able to do that with other people's fish camps. And then I do that at home with where we go fishing. The part of what fish camp is, you have to be at that spot when the fish are there. It's not like farming where you pick the spot for whatever reason and like, okay, this has good soil, or we're going to mend the soil to make this grow. you have to show up when the fish are there. And there's something about that that's just, it takes people out of the domination of choosing what goes where when. And in our current modern era of being able, like, we're going to move land and we're going to farm fish in the ocean and we're going to do all these things that we just have the ability to do, it's very different when you're on the land. Everything else kind of has to melt away, because if the fish are there, the fish are there. And that's, you have your narrow window of time to do that. And there's an intergenerational process of, you can't just do it by yourself. You need to have a group of people together in order to do that. And it's a connection of knowing, like, the reason that we have salmon today is because our ancestors have been taking care of salmon and the water and the land by not destroying it for thousands of years. So there's a responsibility piece that goes with fish camp as well, of making sure that you don't take too much. The fish are giving themselves to you because you're taking good care of them. So that idea of fish camp is, those are some of the things that embody that idea of, like, who we are as people. It's our spirit, it's our connection to the earth.
And you collect the fish skins as well as the fish, right? Those are some of the things you're sewing with.
Yeah, so that's one of the things. When we were out fishing in Good News, I've collected fish skins from the Łiq'a Delta area and different rivers, different parts of the river, out in the ocean, and it helps feed the artwork that I do with fish skin, and being able to see, like, how does this species of fish from this river compare to this one, in which times of year, that was one of the things, like, when I was sewing these boots, I was in Igiagig, and I was sitting at the airport waiting, and there was an elder who was there, and we started talking about fish skins, like, oh, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm working on fish skin. Like, I haven't seen these in years. And so it was cool to be able to show, like, I showed her the seams, and then she asked, like, how did I patch the dorsal fin hole? And we were able to talk about that. And so when I finished them, I texted them to her, like, a picture to her, so I could show her, like, this is, because I hadn't put the soles on yet. I'm like, this is how we did it. And so there's just a connection to traveling that we have with this technology of skin sewing and fish. And it's one of those things that's like, I don't speak Yupik, but when I'm working on the boots, I'll have elders just start talking to me, like, and it's awesome, because it makes people comfortable talking about sharing food or sharing culture, where they're willing to talk to me, even though I'm like, I am not understanding the translation, but I am understanding that they're really excited about it, and by gesturing and showing, and we're able to communicate. So it's a connection that's pretty powerful.
You've been teaching people to sew fish skin now for several years, and how many workshops?
I should count that. So I started working in fish skin in 2010. So it's been over a decade, and I've taught at least 15 workshops. That's a very conservative number. And then, like, when I'm at my tribe's educational fishery, I'll show people what I'm doing when I'm traveling. That's one of the things, like, that's the other part that's so much fun. So there's two times, like, once when I was in Good News Bay, and the other when I was in Copper Center, I was skinning fish and showing kids, like, this is how I skin fish, and we were scraping fish skins, because I'm like, I was working on a dress for a fashion show, and I needed to get the 25 skins done, and I'm doing with the kids, like, what are you working on? I'm like, I'm scraping fish skins. Like, can we help? And I'm like, sure. So we're out there with spoons, and then we're scraping, and have, like, washing, and it's one of those things that's just, like, it's cool to see people come together, because it's like, what are you, oh, sure, can I help? I'm like, yeah. And then actually skinning the fish, people are like, what are you doing? Like, why are you taking off the best part of the fish? And I'm like, I'm skinning, I use the fish skins. They're like, you got to eat that. And so it's part of it's fun
Yeah.
having the conversations that spark when it's like, you crazy young person, what are you doing? Or, oh, this is really interesting, or just the different reactions people have.
But I imagine that sometimes you find yourself in situations where you're teaching individuals or communities, helping to revitalize an art that might have been less practiced or perhaps forgotten or even suppressed historically.
And that's where I can show the father and son duo with the gut parka. That's one of those pieces where we work in gut in my area too, and it's either like bear gut or seal gut, depending on if you're by the ocean or not by the ocean. But that sewing technique that I showed on my boots, that's that what's commonly called the waterproof stitch or the watertight stitch. That's one of those skill sets that was really going away. That part of those workshops is I show students how to do that. I don't require them to use it, but it's like, you need to know how to do this because it's part of the work of teaching what elders have shown me. And then with these statues, visualizing that as well, so that it's out there as like, this is the way that people still use this, but have used it in the past.
Yeah. Thinking about the sculpture, the installation for the health clinic in Bethel, it's you've talked about relatability, like by putting people, by placing or telling a story that is one people are connected to, although they might have their own family variations in terms of clothing and boots and so forth. But could you talk a bit about creating relatability in terms of the ways that you indigenize sculpture or monuments?
So I think that one of the biggest ways is presenting people as live people. And that has to do with the way that they're positioned, what they're doing, and that's a really big piece of it, is not just creating monuments that are designed to showcase that an external force traveled to an area, conquered it, and here's a monument that shows the conquering. This is about, these are the people of this place, and we're still here. So there is that, and that's still creating a monument to something, to our presence, but it's not in a way that shows a conquering. It's the way that shows how we're in tune with the land and with each other as humans versus separating ourselves from the place. So that's like, I'll wheel the statues and just kind of to talk about how I actually physically do that with the statues. So with the mother-daughter, I didn't have the maquette very, so there, able to, and then there's a fish that is hanging down from the daughter, and the fish rack is over here. So there's the connection between the two figures, between the daughter being excited and happy about passing fish to the mom, and then the mom's looking up over at the fish, and it's the connection to the activity of what's happening and the expressions on faces. I'll do the laptop. So this is one of the things that I do with statues is that this is the pupils. I don't carve out the eyes. I outline the eyes, and it makes people's eyes not look hollow. So one of the common practices for bronze statuary is to actually completely hollow out the eye, and then shadow creates the shape of the iris or the pupil, and it makes people look hollow when you carve out their eyes. And so that's one of the things that I don't do. The other way that I do to convey life in people is I leave the texture. I don't sand them down really, really smooth. I leave the texture of like my fingers when I'm working on them, leave that behind so that the skin actually has texture, to where when you're farther away and there's really bright sun on it, there's a lifelike quality to the faces. So that's one of the things. Hair is another piece. It's super tricky to do hair in metal. And so the mother has more, her hair is more contained. And then the daughter's hair is a little bit more wispy, which is it can only be so thin in the metal, but she's got her wisps on her forehead, and it's kind of starting to come out of her bun a little bit. And then if we do the same thing with the son, his hair is has that super short, kind of spiky quality to it, that's able to kind of create layers. And that's one of the things hair is really iconic to people, and trying to figure out like how to make the hair. I spend a lot of time with Yupik friends asking, like, does this look like the hair? Does this feel like the right kind of visual for how your son or daughter's hair does this thing? And then also just the expression of like, are kids mischievous? Are they happy-go-lucky? Like getting the expressions, and then figuring out how to do the age. So as people age, so for the father's hair, having that be a little bit different, because as we age, men age differently than women, and their hair ages differently too. So those are just some of the ways that I, in the faces, convey people as live people.
And there's a slight contemporization I'm sensing, like in the boy's haircut, how he's got the shorter sides, it's a more of a contemporary styling.
Yeah, and that was part of the question of like, with hairstyles, these aren't people from 300 years ago that you'd be like, oh, here's a sketch from an ethnographer of people at first contact. It's like, this is the way that people look like today. And that's doesn't make, just because somebody has a modern haircut or uses fabric made out of cotton, that doesn't make them any less Yupik than if they had long hair or wearing all sealskin. So those are some of the conversations around how to honor and respect culture, but also that our peoples today, we have the authority to determine who we are and how we want to be visualized. And that's part of the piece that's helpful with having the committee be involved, is trying to make sure that it meets that goal. And that's what I strive to do.
Yes. You're a multimedia sculptor, and you've talked, and written about how art's a powerful tool for building understanding, in this sense between what the architecture is intending to convey and the relatability of living Yupik life today around Bethel. Could you talk a bit about some of the other media that you use, and the river, how that works in relationship to the rounded features of the building or other aspects of the installation?
Yeah, so one of the things for me is I'm not Yupik. I have a lot of Yupik friends and who I consider family. But there's some shared connection that I can identify with, and one of those is that connection to water and land. But the hospital, when they did the remodel, each floor has a theme for it. So the theme that the statues are on is the water level, and so that was part of the decision about like having a river concept, even if it's not an actual physical river, but implying that this is where the net is coming through and the fish are coming through that area, is a way of giving, as a client or viewer, approaches the hospital, there's a clue that, oh, there would be something like this in this area. And then when you walk in the doors, the motifs on the walls and the colors and all the plaques are all blue with a specific pattern going through them. So it's part of wayfinding. We use water and rivers as transportation in winter and in summer. So there's this really deep connection to water that is beyond just like, well, fish swim in it kind of thing. It allows us to have the fish come to us. It allows us to go to the ocean. It allows us to visit each other, all those connections that are there. And that's part of the other, like, circle dot motif is a symbol in Yupik culture that's part of that idea of this is that connection to that circle. It's a life way. It's a connection to spirit. It's a connection to each other. And those are things that the river and the water do for us as people. And that's trying to, those are part of some of the conversations that we had. They gave me information. I asked questions to be able to figure out how to really bring that vision to life as a partner in what they were trying to do for the hospital. Mm. And it's rare. There's not places where we can go as Indigenous people and see ourselves in public art. There isn't a lot of Native people displayed publicly. So that's part of the other idea is that it is a hospital, but there are Indigenous connections to some of the health practices that are done, and it can help calm people down when you walk into a hospital environment and it's like, oh, this is my kind of place. This is where I belong. And so, for so long, Indigenous people have been research subjects of Western medicine, that part of turning that away from that direction of negative exploitation is creating physical spaces where we as Native people feel comfortable to go in, compared to historical hospitals where it's like, don't go to the hospital because you're going to die. Instead, it's the idea of being able to go to a clinic or a hospital or a medical facility and feeling like I can get well there, or partner with my medical provider to have some wellness in my life. So it's really to me, it's an important piece about having people identify and feel comfortable and have that sense of ownership that their medical care is something that this is for them and they are a part of, instead of something that's being done to us.
Joel, you've created a few installations that feature Indigenous lifeways around Alaska. How many, and where are they exactly?
So I've made a Dena'ina family in Kenai at the Dena'ina Wellness Center, which is a IHS, just like Bethel Hospital is an IHS, or Indian Health Service facility. And then up at the mouth of Ship Creek with the native village of Łiq'a, on the site where our ancestors would dip net there. And now that's where the Port of Anchorage is built. And so it's showing Joel Isaak, where she put up fish, and where people still fish in that spot, and the whales still come to that spot. When we were installing that's where the belugas were out there. So those are and then this family of 4 is going to Bethel. So that's been part of the experience for me as an artist, being able to work with communities that want to bring representation to their people and to the public of that place as well. But Anchorage is obviously our biggest city in the state, but Bethel and Kenai are smaller places, and so it's one of those things that I think is representative of leadership, making decisions to visualize our people in our local communities.
And I'm inferring too that there might be a way in which you're working, which makes the process more inclusive. You spoke of the committee having a lot of opportunity to weigh in the representation that you're providing. Is that somewhat unique to your process? Is it a way of indigenizing the monument to have that sort of participation, or what might one infer from how you work?
So committee processes, I feel like is a pretty standard process for doing public art work. One of the difference for me has been the committees have been almost, if not entirely, Native people as decision makers. And so that's one of the differences, is who's commissioning and who's really at the committee level. The other piece for me is asking my friends who I've either stayed with or who I consider family, like, does this look like your relatives? And that was part of, I would text people pictures, and I'm like, they were just like, oh, I have a cousin that looks like that, or my aunt looks like that, or so-and-so has that person's cheeks, or my cousin's mischievous in that kind of way too. And that's that factor of like, okay, I'm in the right zone when my friends and the community of people who I was working with see their family members in the faces and the bodies and the hands and stuff like that. So that's one of those connections, that there's an insider outsider, where I am an outsider from the Yupik people, but I'm also an insider in the fact that I've stayed with people for years, and that's part of what any artist would need to do, in my opinion, to be able to have that more indigenized representation. That when I've worked with other artists in different areas, that piece of involvement isn't always there as strongly as I feel like it should be. I definitely have my own personal style of how I sculpt, and I kind of showed like the eyes and the textures and things like that. And sometimes I feel like the danger for artists in doing this kind of monumental work is if I take away too much from the identity of the people through my style, that becomes a problem. Because then it becomes too much about my expression. And so I try and find this line of, I'm interpreting living people into static sculptures, but it needs to be an interpretation that I feel good about, and that the people who I'm interpreting also feel good about. So that's just part of my process with that.
So you're saying, even as an Indigenous person, this kind of porousness and interactivity that you have with present day Indigenous Alaskans and fish camp, different ways in which you learn, their pictures, sharing images are all ways of increasing that relatability and not imposing an idea or an idealization.
Yeah, it's part about, it's kind of like being a cousin, being a good relative.
That's fascinating. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you today. There was just one more concept, if you might speak about it, to kind of, it seems, sort of wraps things together. And you're writing about this new installation for the Dr. Paul John Kalrasarik, correct me if I want to say the name correctly, Kalrasarik Clinic in Bethel. As a multimedia artist, you found a way to kind of speak to the great circle of life, as you referenced that expression. And just in closing, maybe you could summarize how the work and the installation in relationship to the environment and living Indigenous Alaskans today conveys that great circle.
Yeah, so that was one of the pieces that the RFP, the call for, or the call for art that went out, they wrote about that concept. And to me, from the pieces that I heard that really resonated were the land the water, the spirit that you feel between the connection of those pieces, those elements, those beings, and the spirit that we have, and how those tie together. And so that's that to me, that's that cycle, that's that circle, and trying to convey that through what the people are doing, and how they're positioned, and the kind of like the expressions on their faces, and the final landscaping, I think, is another piece that really is going to help tie it together. Is it's plants from that area. It is of that place. It's not coming in with all concrete or something else that are like, here's the imported special plants that have to be taken care of, that have the red leaves or whatever. It's like, this is the land. So I think that's that connection that is tying us as people to that place, and the people in the Delta to where they come from. And I hope that when they travel there, that it's something that's reminiscent of home for them, even if it's not the exact place that their village is. It's something that feels like where they're from, and that anyone coming there who has a connection to water would be able to feel grounded in that place as well.
Mm. And in the process of indigenizing monuments, creating these installations that offer more relatability to Alaskans who might live near or be traveling from farther away, what do you feel your way of working and the messages within indigenized monuments offer to, Alaska as a whole, or our world today in terms of values and ways of being? It seems like it's about so much more than lifting up stories. It's pointing a way forward.
Yeah, I think there's a group of people who are working in a way to make us visible again. And I think that's one of the factors as well for Indigenous people. One of the strategies that has kept us alive is that we kind of went invisible. We tried to go off the radar and fit in and not make any waves, speak English, like do all the things that would kind of assimilate. But that didn't fully happen. And there's still a core being of who we are. And I think that's part of, there has to be space for that in the world, and it creates a richer environment, and figuring out ways that create visibility without extracting from us as people and not re-traumatizing is a critical piece that, as we move forward, needs to continue to happen. And I think that this is part of that trajectory, and that having the Indigenous people at the table as decision makers is an important part. And that's really what it takes to do the work.
It refers to me very largely to the whole American project and the project of colonization. There's a resistance to it that you're, lifting up by proposing alternative and interdependent ways of being, life ways. But it's also something that subtly references numerous different peoples who have built this country, or whose stories are embedded in the land. And that's very exciting to me.
And I think that's part of the other piece of it too, is often, like in our Indigenous languages, we'll talk about, we are people of a place. We're not separate from the land. And I think that's part of the other, how we're represented is that connection. And that's part of that deep inherent conceptual piece of we're not separate from the place, but we're also from this place. We've been here for thousands of years, and our bodies, our languages, our way of life, our clothing is all connected.
Thank you so much, Joel. Tanan, it's been a really wonderful conversation, and a real privilege to come to your studio today to learn so much about how you contemporize and indigenize monuments. Just one question, what foundry did you use? Curious to know.
It's in Palmer, and Patrick Garley is the owner, and it's Arctic Fires Bronze is the name of it. So that's been one of the other things that's awesome, is that I can drive up to Palmer and work locally in Alaska. When I did the other, when I did the statues in Kenai, I did those all at UAF. So I've done my monumental sculptures all in Alaska as far as the fabrication. I did the first three with the studio up with Wendy Krosky at UAF, and then I've been working in Palmer on this last set.
Fabulous. Thank you again so much. We'll return next month with a studio visit to Amy Meisner's Fiber Studio in Anchorage. This has been Asia Freeman for Bunnell Street Art Center with Joel Isaak, whose family is from the village of, will you say it correctly for me, Joel? I want to.
Chagalneet.
Chagalneet. And his family lives in the Soldotna area. Thank you. Be well.